The frost crunched under her boots like shattered glass. Each step across the empty yard felt too loud, echoing in the pre-dawn hush that clung to whispering pine stables. Late January air, sharp as a blade, sliced into her lungs. It carried the familiar scent, damp earth, aging wood, and the sweet, dusty perfume of hay bales stacked high in the loft. But beneath it, always, the ghost of diesel and something else, something metallic and cold. The wind whistled through gaps in the stable block, a lonely sound that found its way deep into the hollow space behind her ribs. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Inside the long barn, the gloom was thick. Dust motes danced in the single weak beam of her flashlight, illuminating floating worlds. Silence, usually punctuated by soft nickers, the shuffle of hooves on bedding, the contented munch of grain. Now just the heavy quiet, broken only by her own breath frosting the air and the frantic drumming inside her chest. Most stalls stood, empty, doors gaping, reminders of the dispersal sale, the inevitable scattering of things after. Only one door remained closed at the far end. Sarah didn't look at the framed show ribbons gathering dust on the office wall as she passed. Didn't linger by the tack room where his worn leather jacket still hung on a hook, smelling faintly of him and saddle soap. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the stall door she was heading towards, a gesture almost unconscious. She focused on the mundane, the grain scoop's weight in her hand, the rattle of the feed bin lid. Routine was the only raft keeping her afloat in this sea of absence. She filled the scoop, the sound unnaturally loud. Her reflection in the dusty window pane showed hollows under her eyes, deeper than yesterday. Then she slid the bolt open, slowly. The rasping metal scraped the silence. Darkness shifted within the stall. Not movement exactly, more like the air itself thickened, condensed. A shape materialized near the back wall, taller than seemed possible in the confined space. Moonlight, weak and filtered through a high, dirty window, caught the curve of a powerful neck, the sharp angle of a shoulder. The horse stood statue still, facing the corner, head slightly lowered. Its coat was an odd, patchy gray, like storm clouds colliding, but with a strange, almost luminous sheen in the poor light. It didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her entrance with the flick of an ear. It simply existed, a solid, silent weight of presence that seemed to absorb the scant light, radiating not menace, but a profound, unsettling stillness, like it was holding its breath. Sarah froze, the scoop heavy in her suddenly numb hand. This wasn't the skittish colt she'd been reluctantly tending. This stillness felt ancient, heavy with something unspoken. The air hummed with it. She saw the faint tracery of scars, thin white lines like cracks in porcelain, marring the gray hide along its flank. Saw the way the ribs still showed a little too clearly beneath the thick winter coat, despite weeks of careful feeding. Saw the utter absence of the curious, assessing gaze she expected from a young horse. This creature looked carved from sorrow and steel. Easy, she murmured, the word barely a puff of vapor. Pointless, maybe. Did it even hear her? She took one, slow step inside, pressing her back against the open door frame. The scent here was different. Warm horse, clean straw, antiseptic from the lingering care of its injuries. But underneath, faint and stubborn, the acrid tang of burnt plastic and fear. It was a smell that belonged to crumpled metal and flashing lights, not a quiet stable. The horse remained facing the wall. Its breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Only the faintest plume of vapor escaped its nostrils, dissipating instantly in the cold air. Sarah waited. The grain scoop felt like lead. She remembered the frantic phone call weeks ago, the animal control officer's grim description, Foal found alive in the wreckage. Mare didn't make it. Vehicle looked like it hit. A wall doing 70. A miracle, they'd called it. A fluke. Now looking at this silent, damaged creature radiating an aura of deep, unhealed shock, miracle felt like a cruel joke. What kind of life began amidst twisted steel and death? She took another step. Then another, moving sideways along the wall, giving the horse space. Her boots scuffed softly on the fresh straw. She reached the feed tub bolted to the wall, several feet away from where the horse stood. Slowly, deliberately, she tilted the scoop. Grain cascaded into the rubber tub with a sound like sudden rain. Cascade, cascade, cascade. One gray ear, tufted and expressive, twitched backwards. Just once. A minute adjustment. The head didn't turn. The body didn't shift. But that single involuntary flick of the ear was the first crack in the statue's facade. Sarah held her breath. She emptied the scoop completely, the sound filling the stall. Then silence rushed back in, thicker than before. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a few feet from the feed tub, her own breath shallow. Minutes stretched, measured only by the frantic beat of her pulse in her ears. The cold seeped through her jacket. The horse remained a dark sentinel facing the wall. The untouched grain smelled sweet and nutty in the frigid air. Then, impossibly slow, like a glacier calving, the horse shifted its weight. Not towards the grain. Not towards her. It turned its massive head, just a fraction. One large dark eye became visible in the gloom, reflecting a sliver of moonlight. It wasn't looking at the food. It was looking directly at her. The eye held no fear, no aggression, just a deep, liquid darkness, observing, assessing. Seeing through her, it felt like, to the hollow place inside where grief had taken root. Sarah felt pinned by that gaze, raw, exposed. It saw the tremor she tried to hide in her hands. It saw the unshed tears burning behind her eyes. It saw the gaping hole where laughter used to live. She wanted to look away, to break the connection, but she couldn't. There was a terrifying intimacy in that silent scrutiny. The horse took a single step, not forward, not backward, just sideways, adjusting its stance. The movement was fluid, powerful muscles shifting beneath the scarred hide. It lowered its head a fraction, nostrils flaring as it drew in a deep, deliberate breath. The sound was loud in the stillness. It wasn't sniffing the air, it was sniffing her, scenting the salt on her skin, the wool of her sweater, the lingering trace of coffee on her breath, and perhaps the deeper scent of shared loss. Its head dipped lower, stretching towards her, not aggressively, but with a tentative, almost painful curiosity. The velvety muzzle, surprisingly soft-looking despite the creature's imposing presence, stopped inches from the sleeve of her jacket. Warm breath, surprisingly moist, ghosted over the worn fabric. Sarah didn't dare breathe. The horse inhaled. Again, a long, slow pull of air, its whiskers brushing lightly against her sleeve. It held the breath for a second, then exhaled softly, a warm sigh that fogged the air between them. Its dark eye remained locked on hers. The message wasn't in words, but in that shared, fragile breath. I see you're hurt. Do you see mine? She didn't reach out, didn't try to touch. She just stood, anchored by that dark, knowing gaze and the phantom warmth of its breath on her sleeve. The untouched grain lay forgotten. The cold receded, replaced by a strange humming warmth spreading from the point where its presence touched. Her own isolation. Minutes bled into each other, marked only by the slow rhythm of their breathing slowly synchronizing. The stall, the cold, the ghosts outside the door. For a suspended moment, they ceased to exist. There was only this damaged creature and her own shattered self, connected by an invisible thread spun from shared silence and unspoken pain. Finally, the spell broke. A truck rumbled distantly on the road beyond the stable block. The horse blinked, slowly, deliberately, breaking the eye contact. It took a step back, returning its gaze to the far wall, the brief connection severed. The statue reformed, but the air felt different, charged. The silence was no longer just empty, it was waiting. Sarah turned to leave, the movement stiff. Her legs felt unsteady. She stepped out of the stall, pulling the heavy door closed behind her, the bolt sliding home with a final thunk. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood. The grain scoop, dangling forgotten from her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the profound quiet inside the stall. She closed her eyes, seeing only that dark, liquid gaze. What had just happened? What strange understanding had passed between a broken woman and a horse born in wreckage? She pushed away from the door, turning to walk down the empty aisle. Back, towards the biting cold of the yard. The frost crunched again under her boots. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because just as she reached the barn door, a soft, distinct sound followed her. The quiet, deliberate shuffle of hooves on straw, stopping just on the other side of the closed stall door. Waiting. The untouched grain hardened in the tub. Weeks bled into late February, the air still sharp, but carrying the faintest, treacherous promise of thaw. Sarah kept her routine. Pre-dawn arrival, the crunch of frost, the scent of hay, and that stubborn, ghostly undertow of diesel, and fear clinging to the gray horse's stall. She called him Gray, a placeholder, a refusal. Giving him a real name felt like opening a door she'd bolted shut. He ate now, methodically, silently. His ribs were less stark beneath the thickening winter coat, the patchy storm cloud gray deepening. But the stillness remained. He watched, her with that unnerving liquid dark eye, tracking her every movement as she mucked the stall, filled water buckets, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. He never whinnied, never stamped. His world was contained within those four wooden walls, his presence a low, constant hum of watchfulness that vibrated in Sarah's bones. Then came the jacket. It was hanging on the old hook outside the tack room, where it always hung. His jacket. Worn brown leather, scarred like its owner, smelling of saddle soap, cold air, and the faintest trace of the cologne he'd worn for special occasions. A scent that still punched Sarah square in the gut. She'd avoided touching it, walking, past it like it was radioactive. One morning, carrying an armful of fresh hay towards Gray's stall, her elbow brushed against the leather sleeve. A sound ripped through the quiet barn, not a whinny, not a squeal. A high, sharp, truncated scream like metal tearing. Sarah froze, hay tumbling from her arms. She spun. Gray stood rigid at the front of his stall, his head thrust over the half door, neck arched, nostrils flared wide and red. His eyes were rolled back, showing white rims, fixed not on her, but on the jacket. His entire body trembled, muscles standing in stark relief beneath his skin. He looked terrified, or enraged, or both. That profound stillness was shattered, replaced by a raw electric panic Sarah had never seen in any horse. "Easy, easy, Gray," she breathed, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She took a cautious step towards his stall, deliberately putting herself between him and the jacket. "It's just an old coat." His gaze snapped to her, wild, unseeing for a second. Then, slowly, the tremors subsided. The whites of his eyes receded, replaced by that familiar dark intensity, but now charged with something new, a desperate, questioning urgency. He blew hard, a cloud of vapor exploding from his nostrils. He didn't look back at the jacket. He looked only at Sarah, as if demanding an explanation she couldn't possibly give. The incident left a crack in the fragile peace. Gray became attuned. Certain words, spoken casually as Sarah talked to herself or muttered instructions, would make his ears snap forward, his head tilt. Drive, home, music, especially Mike, her brother's name. Sarah would say it, perhaps recalling a stupid joke he'd told, and Gray would lift his head from his hay net, that dark eye seeking hers, holding it with unnerving focus until she looked away, the name turning to ash in her mouth. She found herself avoiding words, avoiding the jacket, avoiding the tack room altogether. The barn felt charged again, not with shared silence, but with a gathering storm she couldn't name. The horse wasn't just damaged, he was a conduit to a pain she'd buried under layers of numb routine. His wary trust felt like a mirror reflecting her own guarded heart, and the reflection was becoming unbearable. The breaking point came on a day thick with the promise of rain. Gray had been unusually restless, pacing his stall, stopping often, to stare intently at the far wall near the corner where he'd first stood like a statue. Sarah, scrubbing a stubborn water stain on the concrete floor nearby, felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. Frustration, sharp and sudden, pricked at her. Frustration at the silence, at the ghost in the jacket, at this living, breathing reminder of everything shattered. "What?" she finally snapped, throwing the scrub brush into the bucket with a splash. She stood up, facing him across the stall door. "What is it you want from me? What do you see?" Gray didn't flinch. He held her furious gaze, then deliberately turned his massive head towards that back corner again. He took a single step towards it, then stopped, looking back at her. An unmistakable gesture. "Look," heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and defiance. Sarah unlatched the stall door and stepped inside. Gray moved aside, giving her space, but his attention remained fixed on the corner. The scent of clean straw and horse was strong here, overlaying the fainter, older smells. She knelt, running her hand over the rough wooden planks of the wall, feeling the grain, the knots. Nothing. Then her fingers brushed something different, not a knot. Shallow, deliberate grooves cut into the wood, low down near the baseboard, almost hidden by a thicker layer of straw. She pushed the straw aside, carved into the wood, weathered but clear, were letters. Not a name, not a date, just two initials, intertwined with a clumsily etched heart, M+, a Mike. And Annie, his wife, Sarah's sister-in-law, killed instantly in the crash that had birthed this horse amidst the twisted wreckage of Mike's truck. The truck he'd been driving, too fast. The truck Annie had begged him to slow down in. A sound escaped Sarah's lips, a choked gasp that ripped into a sob. It wasn't a gentle weeping. It was a convulsion, tearing up from a place so deep and dark she thought it had been sealed forever. She crumpled forward, forehead pressing against the cold wood beside the carved initials, her hands clawing at the straw. Years of held-back grief, rage, guilt, the crushing loneliness, the unspeakable image of her brother and his vibrant wife reduced to broken things in metal. It detonated. Her body shook violently, racked by sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart. She didn't cry for Mike or Annie, not solely. She cried for the life she'd locked away, for the hollow shell she'd become, for the sheer, brutal unfairness of it all laid bare in two crude letters carved by her brother's hand, a secret confession in a stable wall. She was barely aware of the heavy presence moving beside her. Warmth radiated against her back, her side. Gray hadn't fled the storm of her grief. He stood close, his massive body a solid wall next to her trembling form. He lowered his head. She felt the soft, warm puff of his breath against the back of her neck, steady and slow, a counter-rhythm to her ragged gasps. Then, the velvety softness of his muzzle touched her shoulder, Not a nudge, not a demand, just a grounding weight. He remained like that, breathing slowly, steadily, his head lowered near hers, a silent, immense pillar in the tempest. He didn't try to stop her tears. He simply held the space, his warm breath a lifeline, his solid presence an anchor in the terrifying flood. He stayed. Long after the violent shaking subsided into exhausted shudders, long after her sobs became quiet, hitched breaths, he stayed, his muzzle resting lightly against her arm, breathing the world back into stillness. The first daffodils were pushing through the cold earth near the barn door. April sunlight, weak but determined, slanted through the high windows, painting stripes of gold on the swept concrete aisle. Sarah hummed softly, a tuneless melody, as she brushed Gray's thick winter coat. Great clouds of loose hair drifted in the sunbeams. He stood relaxed, head lowered, one hind leg cocked, his eyes half closed. The profound stillness was still there, but it had softened, warmed. It was the stillness of deep water, not frozen ice. He'd started meeting her at the stall door when she arrived, his ears pricked forward, a soft nicker rumbling in his chest, a sound she'd never heard before the breakdown. He'd begun to explore the barn aisle on a lead rope, cautiously at first, then with growing curiosity, sniffing at door handles, investigating buckets, his large, dark eyes taking everything in. He still flinched at sudden loud noises, but the wild panic induced by the jacket hadn't returned. Sarah had moved the jacket. She hadn't thrown it away. She'd folded it carefully and placed it in a trunk in the office. A quiet burial. One bright afternoon, Sarah led Gray out into the small, fenced paddock adjacent to the barn. The air held the damp, fertile smell of spring. Gray dropped his head immediately, lipping at the sparse new grass, his tail swishing lazily. Sarah leaned on the fence, watching him. The crushing weight behind her ribs hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, become something she could breathe around. The hollows under her eyes were less pronounced. She could think of Mike now, sometimes, without the world tilting. She could picture Annie's laugh without feeling like her own lungs would collapse. Gray lifted his head, ears swiveling. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past the paddock fence, towards the overgrown ditch that marked the boundary of the property, tangled with brambles and last year's dead weeds. His posture changed, alert, focused. He took a few steps towards the fence line, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Sarah murmured, pushing off the fence. "See a rabbit?" He didn't look back. He walked purposefully along the fence line, stopping where the ditch dipped lowest. He lowered his head, sniffing intently at a thick clump of brambles, partially obscuring something metallic, glinting in the sun. Sarah frowned, climbing carefully over the fence. Gray watched her approach, then nudged his nose insistently towards the brambles. Pushing the thorny branches aside with a gloved hand, Sarah saw it. Not trash, as she'd expected. It was a small, rectangular piece of metal, battered and scratched, half buried in the mud, a license plate bracket. Attached to it, miraculously intact despite the mud and time, was a novelty license plate frame. Plastic, faded, but the words were perfectly clear. "My other car is a horse. Mike." It had been on his truck. A stupid, cheerful joke from Annie, bought at some roadside attraction. Sarah remembered him groaning about it, but never taking it off. Laugh burst from Sarah's lips, a startled, rusty sound she barely recognized. It wasn't a laugh of humor, but of sheer, stunned recognition. She pulled the muddy frame free, wiping the thick grime from the plastic with her thumb. Gray nudged her arm gently with his nose, then blew softly, his warm breath stirring her hair. He wasn't looking at the frame. He was looking at her face. In that moment, holding the silly plastic frame, feeling the warmth of the horse who had led her to it standing solidly beside her, Sarah understood. The foal born in Wreckage hadn't just survived. He'd carried something out of the ruins. Not just his own life, but a fragile, stubborn thread of connection. He'd carried Mike and Annie's love, etched into wood. He'd carried their memory, tangled in the scent of leather. And he'd carried her out of the frozen dark, breath by shared breath, nudging her towards this moment in the spring sun, holding a piece of stupid, beautiful proof that love, even lost, leaves echoes. He hadn't replaced them. He hadn't erased the pain, but he'd shown her that the world wasn't just endings. Sometimes, life emerges from the wreckage, takes its first impossible breath, and becomes the bridge back to living. She leaned her forehead against Gray's solid neck, the cool metal frame clutched in her hand. The sun felt warm on her back. The air smelled of earth and new grass and horse. She closed her eyes. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the slow, steady rhythm of Gray's breathing, the beat of her own heart, and the quiet, persistent hum of a world slowly turning green again. Sometimes the ones who carry you are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story found a way into your heart, please help it reach others. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next tale that might just change your perspective. Leave a comment below telling me what moved you most. Your words fuel these stories. And tap that bell icon so YouTube lets you know the moment a new story arrives, ready to offer its quiet magic. Thank you for being here.